My name is Joanne Pender. I'm independent. How are you? Councillor in Kildare County Council. And to my left is Frank Keoghan. Is that right? From the People's Movement and also from the TEEU, which I think is a Technical Electrical Engineering Union. And Lara Lawless is a community activist from Celbridge. And Lara is going to be speaking to us about the water charges and how we want to stop them and how a mass campaign of non-payment will do that for us. And Frank will be talking to us about the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and how the two relate will be interesting, and it's a very interesting subject. So I'm going to start with Lara, and we'll finish up with Frank, and we'll take questions at the end. I'm also going to pass around, there's a contact sheet there and a clipboard. I'd like to put your names and contact information, and here it is here. We're going to do that. If you'd like to sign it and put your details on it, we can keep you informed and up to date on everything. And I suppose we'll just reflect on the campaign here in Kildare and Newbridge for a little bit. We've been going here for that since, I suppose we had our first meeting was last October or September, October. Which we had a large crowd too. People were very interested, people wanted to get on board, people wanted to come out and fight the water charges. And since then, in the October demonstration, I'm sure we were all there was 100,000 people on the streets, and then again on the 10th of December, and again on the 31st of January. So people have come out in force, clearly against the water charges. A lot of things have happened in between. We have the media, the way the media are reporting on it, the way the police are reacting to it. These are all things to try and push our spirit. What we have to do now, we have to not let that happen. And we have to find a way to push on through and fight the charges. And we believe by a mass campaign of non-payment, we can sink Irish water. So I'm just going to introduce Lara. We asked Lara to speak because Lara spoke at the last demonstration, and we're all very impressed with Lara. She's from Celbridge, she's part of Community Solidarity. I didn't realise that was one of Lara's first time speaking, was it? Or you speak a few times? It was the first time Lara spoke, so that'll go to show Lara speaks from the heart, and I want to welcome her and thank her very much for coming to speak to us. So thank you very much, Lara.
Hi everybody, and thanks for having me. As Joanne said, I'm not used to public speaking, so I might be reading from this a lot. So my name is Lara Lawless, and I live in Celbridge. I work part-time and I'm a student as well. I also campaign with Community Solidarity, and more recently with Scrap the Water Charges campaign. Tonight I'm going to talk about the anti-water charges campaign and the role of the communities in this campaign. I'll then talk about the upcoming March 21st national demo and the importance of non-payment in having the water charges abolished. But firstly, I will talk about my own experience of campaigning locally. About 2 years ago, I got involved with a local campaign group called Community Solidarity. We're a group of local people from Celbridge and Leixlip who came together to campaign against various issues affecting both of our communities, of which austerity has become a major theme. One of the things we decided to do was run one of our members, Brendan Young, in the local elections last year. We did this because, as a group, we felt the issues we stand on, for example, austerity, equality, education and childcare, will have a broader platform to work off. We see that successful election campaign as a measurement of what can be achieved by local community groups, and we see the benefits of this through the media coverage we gained, the numbers we can mobilise for local protests, leaflet drops and growing numbers to public meetings. We as a group have now decided to run a general election campaign with Brendan standing as an independent for North Kildare. This will serve to further broaden our platform for the issues I mentioned earlier, as well as others including housing and healthcare, and will widen our reach. The reason I joined the group, group firstly was that I'm angry and I'm tired of constantly being made pay the bank bailout debt through taxes, including these water charges. And secondly, that I couldn't do it on my own and I didn't know enough about what was going on. Joining the group gave me access to information, support and the opportunity to use my voice. It has also given me the confidence to go out and try to make a change in how this country's run. For me, being part of both community solidarity and the water charges campaign has strengthened my relationship with my community, allowed me to develop my ideas, beliefs and knowledge, and made me more aware of what's happening both locally and nationally. It's also shown me that mass movement of campaigning works, because it has already forced the government into concessions, pushing deadlines back and not putting any penalties into effect for the next year. I've also made great friends along the way. Becoming involved with your local campaign can look like anything from posting leaflets through doors to being part of local and national protests. The main thing is that you do what you are able to do, and whatever that role looks like, it makes a difference to both you and your community. The anti-water charges campaign has been building momentum since last year, and this coming Saturday, the 21st of March, will hopefully see thousands of us back out on the streets for the Right to Water national protest. We've already seen the success of previous protests, and the more people that came out, the more the government have been forced to sit up and take note. They've laid out concession after concession to get us to accept this charge, but don't be conned. These concessions will disappear. Once metering starts, charges will rise, as has been seen in the past with bin charges. With the first bills due out in April, now more than ever, it's vital to get out on the streets and have our voices heard. In the 90s, part of what defeated these charges then were the protests and keeping up the pressure on our local representatives, and that campaign was won. Water charges were abolished. Not only do we advocate for non-payment, we believe that non-payment will sink these water charges. This tactic helped win the anti-water charges campaign in the 90s, and it can be done again this time. If a majority of people don't pay this charge, it becomes unworkable. If you do pay and the charge is abolished, you won't get your money back. At this point, there is little risk in not paying. Minister Alan Kelly has said that after 15 months of non-payment, customers would be charged either 30 or 60 euro on top of their bills, depending on the level of charge that applied to them. By the time this happens, there will be a new government in place and the water charges will hopefully have been abolished. That is minimal risk when you look at what could be charged when the concessions are taken away. 192 euro for one adult, 384 euro for two, 576 euro for three, 768 for four, and 960 for five. And remember, we already pay for water through general taxation, including income tax and other taxes such as VAT. We believe water should continue to be paid for through progressive taxation, as in a wealth tax and/or the property taxation of big businesses. Those who can afford to pay should pay, and the burden should be taken away from low-income earners. Money going to the bank debt should be used to upgrade our water network. There are many reasons not to pay this tax, but if you're still unsure as to whether or not to pay, join your local anti-water charges campaign. Come along to meetings for information and get on to your local representatives. Non-payment will sink this charge, so please join us on Saturday, March 21st at 1 p.m. at Houston Station for the Right to Water protest. Stick together and don't pay now.
Thank you very much, Lara. I'm now going to hand over to Frank Keoghan, and Frank is going to tell us a bit about TTIP, as I said earlier, and maybe focus on how it relates to water charge as well, but give us a broad introduction of TTIP, because a lot of people here may not have heard about TTIP before, and it's very interesting, and I'll let Frank do the talking. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to the organisers for asking me along. It's a complicated subject in many ways, but I suppose if I say that the work that you're doing, even though you might not think, it's having an effect on TTIP or any of these big agreements, opposing water charges is extremely important, and I'll talk to you about that and why as I get through this. So what I'm going to talk about is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It seems an awful long way away, but it's going to impact our lives very severely if it comes into effect. It's between the EU and the US, and most of it is secret. That's the terrible thing about it. But there have been leaks, and there are various other ways in which information has come around. Then there's the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. It starts with C, so that says Canada. It's a very similar agreement with similar kind of objectives, let's put it that way. And those objectives are corporate strength and corporate takeover. And by corporate, I mean big business. And one of the first questions I'm often asked is, why isn't Ireland negotiating this? Why don't we know about it? Why can't we go and ask the government? Well, when we voted for Lisbon, we gave away that right. The EU is negotiating on our behalf. And the EU is responsible for keeping the proposals and the negotiations secret. They're now into their 8th round. 9th round is coming up in end of April. And it's hoped that they'll have it up and agreed by next year. That's the plan. And we forget all these things when they pass by, but the Lisbon Treaty in Article 3 established neoliberalism as the governing principle of the market. And neoliberalism essentially means that business has primacy over everything else. It's called a trade deal. It's generally referred to as TTIP, which is easier to say than TTIP, I suppose. And really what it's about is removing regulatory barriers. Because in essence, the average tariff between the US and the EU is about 3%. Now that's negligible, really, you know, and they could take that away fairly quickly if they wanted to. But regulatory barriers are something that restrict profit of corporations. Regulatory barriers are things like, for example, labour rights, things I've up there, food safety rules, regulations on the use of toxic chemicals, digital privacy laws. All these things are barriers to business, to profit more than business. And they want those removed. And some of these are things that we have fought for. I wanted to put this on so it'd stop after half an hour. You're going to have to stop me. Things that we have fought for over the years, whether in our community organisations, in our trade unions, and right now we're fighting essentially for such a measure, not to be charged for water. And of course, there are large corporations like Veolia and plenty more hovering in the wings, waiting for when the government charges for water, because then they'll get their foot on the ladder, and very quickly you'll find water will be charged at about $1,000 a year. And you know that story yourself, you've heard it enough times. But it also, and this is the serious thing as regards water, it's designed to open up new markets in areas where there have not been private enterprise input before. And you might find it quite shocking that within the Canadian agreement, education, health and water is wide open. And I'll show you the actual document later on. I took a shot of it. But these are key sectors. These are key welfare sectors. These are things that we depend on. You know, they're things that we fall back on in bad times. And who knows where it's going to end. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But what most people know, if they know anything about TTIP, is that it grants foreign investors the right to sue governments if anticipated profits or potential profits are denied to them as a result of legislative action on the part of the government. In other words, if the government brings in a measure that's for the good of the people and it affects the profits of a foreign company, not an Irish one now, a foreign one, it can sue the Irish government in an ad hoc court composed of a few individuals appointed by an adjunct of the World Bank. There's no appeal. The arbitration result is binding, and that's that. You have to stump up. And there have been plenty of examples of this, and I'll give you a few later on. I don't want to go into them right now. And this is called the ISDS process. And it's a dispute resolution procedure. Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. And from a legal perspective, it elevates transnational corporations, and those are multinationals, so we in Ireland probably call them multinationals more commonly, to the status of a nation state. Because it can sue the nation state can lose and has to stump up. So it's a very serious attack on democracy in the EU member states. And the EU Commission is conniving with this. And as you'll see later, our government, not surprisingly, is also conniving behind our backs. So it's not a negotiation between two competing trading partners, which these kind of things usually are. There's a trade agreement, that's what it would be, and to be talking about bringing down tariffs, etc. Instead, there's profit seeking in areas that have not experienced private enterprise before. And that's really what it's about. It'll happen in America, because there are public services in America also, which will be opened up to European multinationals. It's on both sides of the Atlantic. So who's involved? And I think this tells the whole story. The stakeholders that were consulted in Brussels, 92% of the preparatory meetings were with business. There were no NGOs, no community groups, no trade unions. There were a few stuffed organisations funded by the EU that came in as sort of patsies really, just to say there was somebody else in there. That's a shocking thing really, if you think about it. And it has absolutely nothing got to do with democracy at all. And in Washington, it was only marginally better, but I do know there were a couple of trade unions involved in the Washington thing, but they were supporters of the Democratic Party, so they were safe enough to bring in. But 85% there were business interests. And there's a lot of American business interests pushing for the opening of public services in Europe, and Ireland, of course, by extension, in order to make fortunes, as they would see it. And water is one of those, without any doubt, and I'll show you later on why it is. Now, you can imagine that in an environment like that, where there are businessmen sitting down with government civil servants to discuss something like this, and if other interest groups are excluded, well, the interests of business are going to be paramount. So anything that might be of concern to environmentalists, trade unionists, community groups, etc., they just don't figure. It's a pure business interests predominate. And that's a little small picture of what happened that's a little bit out of date now, because there's been more encounters, as they call them, since. You can see the public interest groups, 4%, and 92% private sector lobbyists. And there are approximately 20,000 lobbyists in Brussels. And it was amazed that the Irish Wheat Exporters Association have a couple of lobbyists there, for example. Organisations you never think of can fund lobbyists there. But they're all business lobbyists. So is it transparent? Well, it's not transparent at all. We don't know anything about the demands that the Americans are making. Nothing at all. Obama himself has said they're not releasing any information at all whatsoever. It's a bit scary, really, but they've refused point blank. The EU has come a little bit forward, and that's the basis for some of the information, as well as WikiLeaks. And by corollary, there's a Trans-Pacific agreement at the moment where we can sort of deduce a few things from. But the EU has released the negotiating mandate. It's sort of like a legal document, and you have to sort of look at the ambiguities and all sorts of things that are in it, pretty typical legalese, and figure out what exactly are they on about here. And individual leaks, because you can never get people into a room, but somebody's going to leak something. So there have been individual leaks as well. So we have a fair bit of information at this stage. But we don't know what the conclusions are after each round of talks. That's what we don't really know. But I'll tell you a little bit about what the Canadian ones do. So information only for business lobbyists. And there's a big thing across there that, like the guards put across, saying business only. So this ISDS, this investor-state dispute settlement, I've given you an outline of it, suing countries directly. It's not new. It's in some of the other agreements, like, for instance, the Energy Charter Treaty, where a crowd called UKOS sued Russia and got 57 billion, believe it or not, in compensation from a tribunal. It was essentially a secret tribunal. If the UKOS people hadn't come out and told people what they'd got, it would never have been known. And that's something about like 10% of Russian GDP. It can happen in any country. It's happened in Ecuador, they've been fleeced off. It's happened in Argentina, and it's happened in numerous others as well. I'll give a few more examples later on. And can you believe it? It would allow corporations to sue countries over environmental protection that threatens their profits. And we've already had the example of a water example, as it turns out. Lone Pine Resources, if I remember rightly, sued the government, one of the Canadian provincial governments, because they decided that it was a bad idea to frack under the St. Lawrence River because it might pollute the water. And they got something like 26 million. And there are plenty of other examples as well. I'll give you a couple of other water examples later on. And as I said, there are closed tribunals set up by an adjunct of the World Bank called ICSID, the Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes. 3 fellas, or 3 women, or a mix of whatever. They're private sector. There's no ethics involved in the sense that they can work for companies, they can moonlight. They won't get paid unless the case goes ahead. So they've every interest in trying to come out with a favourable finding in favour of industry so they get more work. They write the rules themselves. Unbelievable, really. They write the rules themselves and there's no appeal. So it's not unbelievable. Jurisprudence is arbitrary. You don't know what the ground rules are, essentially, when you go in. And they talk about expropriation and fair treatment and all this kind of stuff. And they have extended the whole expropriation definition. And if you think about this, if a company claims measures tantamount to expropriation or indirect expropriation, this is of the potential profits the company might make. Regulatory expropriation, where you bring in rules to protect the environment, protect people, or something that, for example, you don't want a load of trucks going through a town at night or something like that, they'll sue you. There's all sorts of things. And there's a reasonable, how do you define a reasonable expectation of profits? How do you do that? You can't. It's arbitrary what the 3 people think reasonable is. So the award will be arbitrary, similarly. So they've also extended the definition of investment to include everything. At one end, these instruments that were used by hedge funds, and the other end, holiday homes. Everything in between is classified as an investment by a foreign corporation. But they don't prohibit any repatriation of profits. So very much in their interest. And there's something then that prevents governments from making regulations in the interests of the people they're supposed to represent. And we might call it a regulatory freeze or a regulatory chill, where governments, because they're afraid they're going to be sued for a massive amount of money and have to stump up, will be reluctant to bring in new regulations, new laws that might help people. And anyway, under the new regime, if they're going to do something like that, they have to inform something called the Regulatory Council that they're going to do it. So they have time to object behind closed doors. So essentially we're heading into a period, if this comes through, of continual regulatory chill. It'll be very hard to get the government to regulate on some welfare measure, for example.
Tie into how, for example, the government wouldn't allow us a referendum on the water charges. Because a referendum, we could have decided we were never going to privatise Irish water. What they gave us instead was maybe the will or the shall have a plebiscite. And the difference between a referendum and a plebiscite is that a plebiscite doesn't compel the government to do anything. It just forms opinion. So, you know, our opinion is already quite known by the feet in the street and everything else, but if they have opinion and people are not in favour of privatisation of Irish water, they can ignore that, whereas they can't ignore a referendum. So, and as well as that, other interesting things like that, the reason why they don't want revenue involved in it is because then it does become a tax and they can't privatise that. So really what they're looking to do is privatise Irish water so that they can privatise the income stream, and then they can create something to go to the market. And what we've seen in other countries when they've privatised their public services, and that's what our water is, it's public service, it's a common good. When they've privatised those services, and the likes of companies in the UK, the increase in tariffs have gone up by, in some cases, 82%. in private companies, and all over the UK there's quite a good bit of information online. You can see the rise in the prices of the water bills. And while the price of the water bills have risen, their investment hasn't. So they haven't actually invested the money that they said they were going to invest in the infrastructure. All they've done is increase the prices and increase their profits. And if we bring in, how TTIP is related, if we bring in TTIP as well, then we're really risking that we will never be able to reverse that decision. Once they privatise it, we will never be able to reverse it. And what they've done with other public services when they privatise it, made it almost impossible to reverse it. And again, when we already have partial privatisation of the water treatment services, like Frank said, in Viola. I know in Trolling and Athy, there's a 20-year contract on that by Viola. They treat the water. I mean, that's essentially partial privatisation of the treatment of our water. So they're trying to go full privatisation on this. And we all know once it's privatised, they're going to try and increase their profits as much as possible, which means driving down wages, driving down conditions, lack of investment. So, for example, when they say they need 10 billion to invest in the infrastructure over the next number of years to get the lead and asbestos and everything else out of the pipes that we have, how are they going to meet that 10 billion? They're going to go to the markets to look for loans. And at the moment they can't do that, because in order to keep Irish Water off Ireland's balance sheets, they have to keep it, or they have to privatise it, or they have to get over 50% of the income to Irish Water from customers. Now at the moment, the amount of income they get from the state adds up to about 45% of the funding to Irish Water at the moment. And 45% is teetering, you know, so if we look at the polls and we see that over 90% of people who are saying they're not going to pay, if that rings true, then they have a serious problem on their hands, because if they don't meet that 50%, they're failing that Eurostat test, and they have to turn around and say, well no, actually you can't keep this off the balance sheet, that has to go in, and that can then be counted as part of the national deficit figures. And they don't want that to happen. So if it does fail the Eurostat test, it puts them under huge pressure then to go back to the drawing board, and that's what we want. We want them to go back to the drawing board, and we want to continue to pay for water services through progressive taxation. And then people say, well, where do you get the money for that? You know, and it's quite simple. A lot of people have been saying it throughout the years. We pay, you know, 8 billion every year in interest towards our national debt. 1.2 billion of that is for the bank bailout alone. So, you know, it's about choice. It's about how we choose to fund our public services, how we choose to fund the things we as people need in society. And, you know, we should be making the choice to do the decent thing and stop putting austerity onto people and fund public services through the money we shouldn't be servicing the bank debt with. So 1.2 billion every year is servicing the bank debt. We should have people in there who's going to make the decision to say, well no, we're not paying that. We're not paying it anymore because actually people are suffering too much. We need to pay for public services out of that money. Also, I mean, you can see there's an amount of wealth in this country, and it's always, the gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger and bigger all the time. So if we actually did say, right, well, the rich can pay more, so let the rich pay more, and that can fund public services. So there's a number of options. You know, there was also some financial transaction taxes that if really Europe got behind and actually started to make the people who caused the crisis pay for the crisis instead of the people who have no more to give. You know, there are options there, so it's all about choice. And the government are happy to let us believe that there is no choice. But we know there's plenty of choice. So we need to mobilise, and that's why we need to do this, because we need to get together and we need to say, enough is enough. There are choices out there, and we need you to make the correct choice for the people in the country. And you're back up and running then, so
Thank you all for your patience. I hope it works. I just want to say something very briefly about this. The standards applied by the EU are quite different from standards in America. If you think of things like food additives, for example, if you think of the use of chemicals if you think of any of the paints, for example, you use, all the standards in those are based on what's called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is very important because a product may be withdrawn from market if there's a risk that it might do you harm. Essentially, that's it. There's a risk that it might do you harm. Now, it's completely different in America, where they let it go onto the market. There's only been 8 chemicals, for example, banned out of 82,000. The last 82,000 have come on the market in America. But in the EU, there's an awful lot more have been banned. And of course, the American chemical corporations want to get in here with those, and they want the EU to abandon the precautionary principle. And the woman is the EU, and the American corporation is the fellow saying, prove that it's not safe. And it's very interesting that the people who are doing the most lobbying are agribusiness and food, because Monsanto and their friends, of course, want to break into the market. They want to get GMO food into Europe. There have been some changes recently, and they're having some effect, I think, but we have to look at all that as well. So, I'll move on from that actually, because I've said what it is. It's very important that we remember that TTIP is not just about suing the government, it's not just about privatisation of water, it's also about our food quality, food standards, etc., etc. Now, privatisation, this is where the water issue comes in, I think. Liberalisation is a nice word, but liberalisation of services essentially means privatisation of services. And I was a bit surprised myself, I have to say, when I first saw that the Canadian one was opening up education, health and water to privatisation. I was a bit surprised. And as Joanne has said, once it's privatised, there's no going back. That's it. And you probably know that quite a lot of European municipalities in France, even in Germany, have re-municipalised, I might use that word, their water services, having first privatised them, because they found that they were desperately inefficient. Some place like Lille comes to mind, Paris, for example, bigger city. So they become impossible. And this is all revolves around something called a negative list. And it's a list of things that you don't want to open up to private competition. Now previously, the EU method was it had a positive list. In other words, you list the stuff that you want to open up to competition. It may sound a bit sort of iffy, but if you think about it, if you're making an agreement with somebody and you say, all right, I'm opening up education, I'm not opening up health. Well, which one would you put on the negative list? Well, it's the one that you're not going to open up, you put on the negative list. That becomes important when I show you the documentation later. Now, if this is the case, it's a dramatic shift away. And you can see down here at the bottom an example of what happened in England with water. These are just some of the water companies in England. And there is no doubt about it that in the case of the Canadian agreement, the EU water providers like Veolia want access to the Canadian market, which is purely municipalised. And coming the other way, the water companies are not as strong. The European water companies are much stronger. And this is the important bit, which is extracted directly from the Canadian agreement. And it says, the parties recognise that water in its natural state. This is how these sort of agreements are very hard to read. Water in its natural state. That means water in lakes, rivers, reservoirs and so on is not a good or a product. And therefore, it's out. It's not subject to the terms of the agreement. So it's not worried about lakes, aquifers and such things. But, and I'll skip this bit, where a party permits the commercial use of a specific water source, it shall do so in a manner consistent with the agreement. What does that mean? It means, down here, trade and investment in environmental goods and services, including environmental and green technologies and practices, renewable energy and energy efficiency use, and water use, conservation and treatment. And that can be put up here on the end of this. So if you have permit commercial use of the water. In other words, if you're charging for the provision of the water, that's a commercial use. So it's then open under this agreement for privatisation. But there's no obligation, and I have to say that, to privatise. But that's where the next bit comes in. If you look at CETA, this is all small print. It's terrible hard to read from where you are. But I'll just tell you what the things that the Irish government, and you won't be surprised, don't want privatised under the Canadian agreement. Cross-border services, executive search, that's amazing. Banking and other financial services, you don't want any of that privatised at all. Financial services, the provision of investment services or investment advice, and the whole rigmarole requires authorisation from the government, etc., etc. Types of reservation here: senior management and boards of directors, recruitment. Adopt and maintain any measures with respect to the provision of privately funded social services, other than services relating to convalescent rest houses and old people's homes. So they've reserved that bit. Don't see water anywhere. And the last thing is about buses, country buses. It's incredible. Nothing else. That's it. That's everything else in this country. If we accept this Canadian agreement, will be open for privatisation. I don't see water in there at all. That's a screenshot of the actual agreement itself. It reads more or less like what I've said. If any of you want this kind of stuff, you can just give me your email and I'll send it to you. So, they were to do a sustainable impact assessment. This is supposed to be deciding whether it's a sustainable thing to privatise water, etc. And it calls for cooperation on a study outside of the sustainable impact assessment on the impact of privatisation of water sources that might, in the long term, indirectly result from CETA. That's the Canadian agreement. Hasn't been done yet. Can't find it anywhere, or it's a secret. So they're not interested in sustainability. They're not interested in anything like that. This is just window dressing for people who might have complained or whatever. So, that's the first thing. And then CETA also will push privatisation. There's a ban on equity caps, for example. Performance requirements. And other service-related provisions that will ultimately be locked into law and protected with a dispute resolution mechanism. So if you want to get it back, you're going to be sued. And probably a lot of the what I would call semi-privatisation of water is going on at the moment. Joanne mentioned some of these instances. This design, build and operate sort of, what would I call it, nexus, let's call it that, that councils generally are using now, gives the contractors 20-year contracts. So they're sitting on a 20-year contract worth 15 or 16 million. And there's plenty of them around the country. Now, if CETA comes in or TTIP comes in the meantime, that's it. That treatment and provision of water is already essentially privatised. It's the operate part that's what's important. So you try to take it back, you're in trouble. They'll sue you. And they might be successful. They have a good chance of being successful. And most of these Irish companies can't sue, I have to say that. So only the multinationals can sue. So, if you look at the Canadian EU agreement, and the sort of prelude or the preview, what do you call it? The preface, I should say, the preface to the Sustainability Impact Assessment says, and if you read EU for Canada, Canada-EU trade would allow deeper penetration of EU-based water utilities in Canada. There's only one way they can do it. Privatising would allow deeper penetration. That just means over time they will penetrate fully. This could lead to changes in water management and water consumption. It's EU jargon for let's grab it. Increased liberalisation of this sector could provide benefits to EU environmental service providers as they are able to capitalise on greater market access to Canada's water management system. Now, there's no similar statement for Europe, but of course the Canadians aren't going to give away theirs without a similar access agreement. And remember, Veolia and all those have subsidiaries in Canada, and if they haven't got one, they can set it up very easily after they have penetrated, and they can then, the Canadian firm can sue Ireland or some European country. It's now a foreign company. And CETA, there was obviously pressure because they banned the setting up of postbox companies or letterbox companies. You have to have some economic interest, but it's very easy to establish. So they're back in here then, and hey presto, their water is privatised. And all this is gradual, unfortunately. It doesn't happen overnight. It's little incremental steps. This is one, I was down in Galway, I was talking to some people down there, and I looked at how it might be done, and it's the design build operated, DBOs, definitely. And down there was a crowd called Lanagua. You would think that's an Irish company. Not at all. It's owned by this crowd, Mota Engel, which is a Portuguese crowd. And they were given, what, 16 million. The contract that they got to design and build was 16 million, and the operation and maintenance contract was 16. That's 32 million for a start. And it's for 20 years. 16 water treatment plants. And it's not inconceivable that they would turn off the water at the end of that to force the contract. There's one thing certain, all the skills have gone out of local government, all the skills have gone out of that area. There's nobody capable of operating those plants anymore, in most councils. So they couldn't take them over. So they're going to remain privatised. So this is a huge fight we're having in hands. It's a huge fight. And as I said, they're at it already. This is down the road. This is down the road in Osborstown, near Nez. 33 million was the value of the contract signed last July. 33 million is an awful lot of money, isn't it? Between Irish Water and who? Veolia. Largest water firm in the world. And the contractor will take over the running of the plant for the duration of the works, finished in September 2016. Watch this space. Who's going to get the contract? Veolia. Or some stubby will get it. Somebody like Fermoy Water Services will get it. And then Veolia will buy them out. It's very simple. That's what they do all over the world. I know it sounds terrible and very negative, but you know, all of this it's out there. And the EU might help out, because there's a ruling from the ECJ that government services for which a fee is charged lose their protection from free market competition. Now, there's a caveat on it. The directive will be reviewed in 3 years, etc., and it's not as forceful as TTIP and CETA, but it's still a real danger, and compels councils to tendering against themselves. Just to mention, Veolia is the world's largest supplier of water services. That's the one that's down in Osborstown. They're also around the country. And of course, Irish Water has employed them with regard to putting in meters as well. There is putting in meters in front, I've just forgotten about it. Is it putting in the meters, isn't it? Or providing the meters, I can't remember which. Providing the meters, isn't it? And it's in 66 countries, has 100,000 workers, and you can see all the rest of it. 139 million inhabitants it provides with water. Powerful multinational. And this is the one I talked about, St. Lawrence River. But here's another one. Here's an extraordinary one. An American company. It's a Canadian company with a subsidiary in America that sued the Canadian government back into Canada, right, in this instance here. 100 million for water rights. Now, it was a pulp mill, and they use a lot of water when they're making paper. So they also had trees, by the way, which is another interesting environmental question. And they successfully sued the Canadian government. They got the 100 million, was it? That's 100 million, yeah. But not only that, they succeeded in holding the water rights that they were given to operate the pulp mill. In other words, the Canadian government lost them. That was the government in Newfoundland. They lost the water rights. This crowd now own the water rights to that particular area. That's extraordinary. How can that happen? Would you think water would be a sovereign thing, but the government will always own the water for the good of the people? Not so anymore. They got the forestry as well. And they left without paying the workers' pensions, etc., etc. Water tends towards monopoly. The provision of water is too expensive, and consequently conglomerates or large companies are more likely to provide the service. So the competition between the companies only occurs at the bidding phase. In other words, when it's put out the contract. That's where the competition occurs. And that's the end of the competition. There's no more competition after that. And it's very hard for a council to figure out, are they fixing the pipes right? Because you can't see the damn things. So there's cheating going on. There's plenty of examples of water companies cheating all over the world. Cheating municipalities and cheating county councils or provincial councils or whatever. So you can't monitor the contractor's performance. So they have a foot in the door. And that's what I said. They have a foot in the door now. They already have a foot in the door. So whenever a council, if it's an Irish county council or a city council or Irish Water, tenders for any goods or services, goods being water treatment technologies, services, engineering, design, construction, relating to water supply systems, the contractual relationship that they enter into can provide a platform. If CETA or TTIP come in the meantime, then that is the platform on which they can claim this is privatised already. There's a private provider either providing the materials or doing the work for you. And we anticipate getting X amount of profits. So in 20 years' time, when these 20-year contracts are up, you go out to tender again. Do you think the county council is going to be able to tender? Don't have the know-how anymore. I think it just fall apart. And by then, if TTIP or CETA or EU rules, which are incrementally moving forward towards privatisation are in place, then of course it will be very easy for them to do. And that's the importance of your fight at the moment. It's an incredibly important fight altogether. I'll just say very briefly, I'll pass by this very quickly. Labour standards will go because the US will look for convergence of regulations, and they haven't signed many of the basic International Labour Organization standards, things like, for example, collective bargaining, freedom of association, the right to organise. They haven't signed any of those. And maybe you haven't heard about it, but there's these right to work legislation in America now, which basically pushes unions out of the workplace, breaks them and pushes them out of the workplace. So really this is about relocating production to areas of lower wages, lower conditions, and it's an international race to the bottom. That's essentially what it is. Jobs, very briefly. All sorts of promises. You're going to hear this on the 24th. There's the Copenhagen Institute, it's going to make a report in Dublin Castle about Ireland's prospects. Wonderful, you might say. Mr. Bruton is going around and saying there's 400,000 jobs. He doesn't say where they are. Of course, inefficient companies will go to the wall in the face of this kind of competition. Doesn't mean the jobs are going to be created in the same place. The EU itself says 1.3 million people will lose their jobs when this agreement comes in. They expect to get jobs elsewhere. But jobs elsewhere need not necessarily be in Ireland, for example. Need not necessarily be in the same occupational categories that the people work in. And there definitely will be a lag between the less competitive companies closing down and the more competitive ones opening up. So you might be an electrician in Ireland and end up having to work in a salt mine in Silesia. That's really what it's about. And I'm not messing, because they've actually allocated funds for this already. They've allocated funds. Absolutely unbelievable. And I can tell you that I've written down the amount of funds, I just can't remember it off the top of my head.
Sorry, Brendan, who allocated funds?
The EU. They've allocated funds, they've advised governments to start gearing up to spend them. So we don't know where those jobs will be, or if they will be created at all. Mr. Bruton says that we will get a 1.1 increase in Irish GDP and 8,000 additional jobs. He's no basis for saying that at all. There's a joint Oireachtas Committee on European Affairs, and it said, and they said, they warned the minister, they said TTIP may lead to job displacement. That means the jobs are somewhere else, and loss of employment. And they warned him that he better do a comprehensive investigation. And they called for a deeper debate, which they haven't got, and probably won't get. We're still waiting. I'll just skip that, it's all bad news there. The EU, this is where I have the money, 70 billion. The European Social Fund has been assigned 70 billion euro to cover the initial shock of the unemployment. 70 billion euro over the 7 years, 2014 to 2020, the end of 2020. That's a lot of money, 70 billion. And in the words of the EU, this is to deal with what could be prolonged and substantial adjustment costs. In other words, unemployment benefit as a result of people losing their jobs, and other social costs. I won't go at regulatory conversions, I'll leave it. CETA has been completed, the agreement is ready to go, but there's a row over how it will be ratified. We mentioned referendums earlier. A row about how it will be ratified. So it's in the European Court of Justice at the moment, but it's in there as the EU-Singapore agreement. And there are some areas where the EU has complete competence, and there are other areas where they don't. And the ones where they don't are called mixed agreements. So whether we get to have a say, and by we I mean our government, whether our government gets to have a say as a government, comes down to the outcome of the ECJ decision, which is expected in June. The EU, of course, is saying that, oh, it's very democratic, every country will have a say, but that's only the one person who's on the Council of Ministers will have a vote. And we have 0.8% of the votes. 0.8% of the votes in the Council, thanks to the Lisbon Treaty. Bruton threatened the EU Commission with a number of others. I won't go into that. But I will show you this, because I put this into this today, one of the things I put in today. That's him TTIPing his cap with Obama. But he said, we're very big supporters of this, he said. Didn't hear that on RTE. I got this off Deutsche Welle, a German radio station. Right? And he said that we're very supportive of TTIP. Next 6 months will be very important because, of course, coming into the presidential election, the other fellow will be too busy trying to get himself off the stage and get Hillary Clinton elected or whatever. Terrible stuff. When you look at what the EU studies produce, and this is also hard to believe, gains of 0.5% GDP growth over 10 years. That's not 0.5% per year. That's 0.05% per year over the 10 years. I've checked that out because I misread it the first time. And they're saying at the end of that 10 years, you have an extra 545 in disposable income for a family of 4. Yippee! Translates into 260 each per week. And these are people drinking their coffee, because they're supposed to get a cup of coffee. And you're risking all these other things to get a cup of coffee per month. It's crazy stuff. And you really have to tell your friends about this. I'm serious. Should be scrapped. Because even if the ISDS, which everybody's upset about, is removed, there's all the threats to food safety, there's all the chemical stuff and all that kind of stuff. Right. Threats are all too real, the benefits are illusory. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We have a little campaign. We're a small organisation. We've had a few demonstrations and we'll have more. We have a little booklet which we're going to republish, update it, because there is more information. And it's important that people get on board, even if I don't care who they do the protesting with, or who they write to, or who they complain to, as long as they do it. So the EU says, EU Commission, TTIP is likely to bring prolonged and substantial dislocation of EU workers. That's from the Commission. That's pretty straightforward. But they're not publicising it, of course. So all I say to you is keep up the good work. It's great that you're here tonight. I'm not so sure it's nice to be listening to me, but certainly it's great you're here. It's great that you're resolved to continue, because what you're doing is much larger than complaining about water charges. It is a much larger fight. And keep it up. Hope that there's a great crowd on Saturday, and see some of you there, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was very interesting. I certainly learned an awful lot. There was a lot more in that than there was in the little book that I read, so that's great. But yeah, but that just goes to show, for us, it's water charges now. It was household charges. It was property taxes, and it's the combined austerity and the driving down of our lifestyles, our livelihoods, our everything that's affecting our daily lives, But what we need to do now is we're looking at the broader picture. At the moment, people are not happy with the concessions, but the government thought we would be. And they're purposely low enough. The concessions were aimed purposely low enough to just get the right amount of people. And the people who were not agreeing with the water charges because they were so high, or the people that said, oh, you know, well, I don't mind to pay a little bit, but, you know, not that much. And they aimed the concessions so low as to get those people in the door, to get those people over the line. But me and you know well that after 2018 and 2019, this is what we're looking at. This is easily what we're looking at. And then some. So that's why we have to make sure people are aware that those concessions are only carrots that were put at the end of the line to reel us in. And that's all they are. And that's why it's important that everybody comes out on Saturday, because the government think they're great, you know, they think they've gotten people down a bit. They think, you know, that the turnout at March is going to be low. But we need to tell people, you need to go away from here tonight, telling your family, telling your friends that, you know, that is not the case. We actually need to keep on this, and we need to actually fight with more vigour, because this is what we're looking at, the broader picture, the information they don't want you to know. And this is why we need to fight it now, because we need to stop it in its tracks. And the broader agenda of austerity. And it's not just about water charges anymore either. I mean, there's a whole host of austerity that they're pushing down the line. In July, over 30,000 one-parent families are going to lose a lot of money when their children turn 7. You know, and those people are facing an awful lot of issues with rent caps, with the housing crisis, with everything else on top of it. And then they're going to be looking at these water charges. So it's not just about us. It's not just about, I'm all right, Jack, I can afford €160. It's about everybody else who can't, and it's about looking to the future. So I hope people go away this evening. There's a big box of leaflets there. If everybody can take a couple of leaflets with them, take a bundle of leaflets with them and say, right, I'm going out tomorrow. I'm going to do my estate. I'm going to go to the local shop. I'm going to ask the shopkeeper, will he put a bundle on the counter? I'm going to go to the chipper, the taxi office. I'm going to say, please put these on the counter, because we need people out on Saturday. We need the same amount of people out on Saturday, because we don't want the government thinking that we've faltered in any way, because we haven't. We haven't. People do get fatigued over the length of a campaign, and that's normal. But the real test will be, as well as mobilisations, is when those bills come in April. And people need to be encouraged not to pay. People need to realise it's okay not to pay. The penalties are so small that even if you have the money, and a lot of people don't have it, remember the concessions are small for the moment, but even if you have it, put it aside and say, no, actually, I'm going to try my very best to stand in solidarity with my family and my friends who are facing this. And for the broader picture, to fight the broader picture, put it aside, say, no, actually, I'm going to come out and I'm going to fight with the people against these water charges. And show the government that we are determined. And if we do this one thing, we have a real chance to fight back and to say to the government, no, actually, this is one thing we can do to show you we're against all the bailout taxes. We're against the austerity you've thrown on our shoulders. You've given us no other choice in everything else. In the property taxes, in the household charges, you came and you stole it from our wages. Through tax credits, through everything else, you came through our pensions and you stole it from our wages. This we actually have to give you, and we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And we stand beside each other in solidarity when we say, we're not giving you another cent. And they'll be forced to back down on this. And they'll have to. And if we make it politically impossible for them to bring this in, who is going to knock on your door and tell you they're in favour of water charges come the next election? Who will do it? And you will stand up to them and say, absolutely, you will not get my vote. And that will put the fear in them. Because that's all they're after. If we stand together, we boycott these charges, we have the power to do that. People have to realise you have every power to do this. You do. So you just need to say, it's okay to do this. I'm not afraid not to pay. Not in the slightest bit. But as long as people stand together and enough people do it together, we can achieve this. It's very, very achievable. So I need people to leave here with their name on that list to say they want to keep informed and that they're willing to help out. If that means putting up some posters, if that means sharing some information, that's fair enough. Whatever people can do, all is very helpful. I need people to leave with a bundle of leaflets and tell people to come on Saturday. There's a bus going from Rathangan at 11 o'clock, from Kildare town at 11:15, and from Newbridge at 11:30, and it's €10 return. Make sure you take that phone number. If you don't already have a way of getting there on Saturday, go on the bus. It's good for people to go together. It gives a sense of camaraderie. People feel like they're in this together, and a sense of achievement, and it's a great day for everybody. It's not something we're going to complain about. It's actually a celebration of people standing up and people power uniting against austerity. And when people say, oh, 800,000 people have failed to register, I say no, 800,000 people have succeeded in boycotting, and more will boycott when the bills arrive, and that's what we need to do. So I'd open the floor up to questions. I'm sure there'll be questions for Frank and for us, and if we can answer them at all, we will. And thanks for coming. Any questions? No.